The polished glass walls of the 34th floor conference room reflected the Manhattan skyline like a living painting, but all eyes were on the mahogany chessboard in the center of the table. "I'll make you a deal," drawled Caroline Vega, CEO of Vega Dynamics, her red lipstick curving into a smile sharp enough to cut glass. She leaned back in her chair, a diamond bracelet sliding down her wrist with a glint that caught the afternoon sun. "Beat me in chess, and I'll marry you." It was supposed to be a joke. At least, that's how she said it. A room full of executives chuckled under their breath, unsure if they were laughing at her wit or her audacity. Across from her sat Daniel Brooks, 34, hair slightly mussed, wearing a shirt that had lost its fight with the ironing board sometime last year. His jeans were faded, his sneakers scuffed, and a small square of grease clung stubbornly to his forearm, like it knew he didn't belong here. The faint smell of motor oil clung to him despite the hurried shower he'd taken before boarding the subway. He wasn't supposed to be in this room. He was here to fix a busted elevator motor. And yet here he was, with the CEO's gaze locked on him like he was a puzzle she couldn't resist solving. Daniel cleared his throat, his voice low but steady. "You don't even know my last name. I know you've been watching me work all week," she said, tapping a manicured finger on the table, her eyes never leaving his. "And I know you've been avoiding eye contact every time I caught you. That's interesting to me." The executives shifted uncomfortably, like extras who suddenly realized the movie wasn't about them. Daniel's lips curved, not in amusement, but in disbelief. "Lady, I've been avoiding you because you look like the kind of person who'd charge a man for breathing her air." Her smile deepened. "You're not wrong. But you didn't answer my challenge." She gestured to the board. "One game. If you win, you get me. If you lose." "What do you get?" he asked. She tilted her head. "That's the fun part. I haven't decided yet." He stared at her for a long moment, weighing whether this was just a rich woman's boredom or something sharper, something dangerous. Then he noticed it. The way she sat forward, the tiny crease between her brows. This wasn't boredom. This was a hunt. He sat down. "White or black?" "Ladies first," she said, sliding the white queen's pawn forward. 3 moves later, his rook slammed down on her king's escape square. Checkmate. The room went silent. Caroline Vega, who hadn't lost a public match in 8 years, blinked once. Then, unexpectedly, she laughed. Low, rich, and not the least bit embarrassed. "Well," she said, leaning closer. "Looks like I'm a woman of my word." Caroline recovered first. She set her king gently on its side, her fingers lingering like she was trying to memorize the shape of defeat. "You've done this before," she said, her voice cool but edged with something curious. Daniel leaned back, folding his arms. "Once or twice." "That was not once or twice skill," she pressed. "That was deliberate. Surgical." He shrugged, the motion casual, but his eyes stayed locked on hers. "Guess I'm just lucky." The corner of her mouth ticked upward. She didn't believe in luck. Not in business, not in life. The executives had begun whispering, glancing between them like they were watching a slow-motion car crash. But Caroline ignored them. "What's your story, Daniel Brooks?" "Elevator mechanic by day, chess assassin by night." He gave a half-smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I fix things. That's all." It wasn't an answer, and she knew it. Caroline leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table. "You know, most people fold when I put them on the spot. You didn't. I don't scare easy." That wasn't entirely true. His stomach was a knot, his palms were damp, and the whole floor still smelled faintly of whatever cologne her assistant had spritzed in here earlier, something expensive, heady, almost dizzying. But he wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of seeing that. "You should," she said softly. "People who win against me don't always come out ahead." The words were part warning, part dare, and he recognized it instantly. He'd grown up around men who spoke in the same tone before bar fights. Daniel pushed back from the table, the chair's legs scraping against the polished floor. "Thanks for the game, Ms. Vega." Her eyes narrowed slightly at the formal address. She was used to being called Caroline, or, depending on the man, darling. He turned to leave, but she called after him. "You play again, and I'll double the stakes." He stopped, looked over his shoulder. "I'm not for sale." The room went still again, a silence so thick you could hear the hum of the HVAC system. Her expression barely shifted, but inside, something unexpected flickered, a mix of irritation, and respect. He walked out without looking back. Caroline sat alone for a long moment, ignoring the awkward shuffling of her staff as they pretended to busy themselves. That game had told her two things. 1. Daniel Brooks had skill most people never stumbled into by accident. 2. He was hiding something. And Caroline Vega didn't just play to win. She played to know. The next time Caroline saw him, he was crouched in the corner of the service hallway, sleeves pushed up, hands deep inside the open panel of a freight elevator. The hum of machinery filled the air, mixed with the faint scent of machine oil and, unexpectedly, coffee. "You're back," she said, leaning against the wall. Daniel didn't look up. Elevator still wasn't running smooth. "Thought I'd take another look before it gets worse. Is that part of the contract?" He gave a low chuckle. "No, just didn't want your executives getting stuck between floors. Thought that might ruin your next power move." She smirked despite herself. "Considerate of you." Silence stretched for a beat. Then she noticed it, a frayed backpack leaning against the wall. A child's sketchbook poked out of the side pocket, its cover worn and bent. "You have kids?" she asked. He hesitated for just a fraction of a second, then nodded. "One. Sophie. She's 8. Caroline's tone softened without her permission. "Where's her mom?" "Gone," he said simply, his hands still working the wires. "It's just me and her." Caroline felt something shift in her chest. She'd built her life on control, on never needing anyone. The thought of a man raising a child alone, without a safety net, felt both foreign and oddly admirable. "Must be a lot to juggle," she said. Daniel finally looked up at her. "Yeah, but she's worth every minute I don't sleep." The way he said it, quiet, steady, no hint of complaint, made her throat tighten. Unexpectedly, she had board members, investors, entire divisions that depended on her decisions. Yet sometimes she went home to a condo so silent it made her want to turn on the TV just to fill the space. "You any good at chess?" he asked suddenly. She blinked. "You just beat me in 3 moves." He smiled faintly. "Yeah, but you've been playing in glass towers. I learned on a porch in the middle of summer, with a man who'd light his last cigarette just to keep teaching me. My dad worked double shifts, but he still showed me how to think 10 steps ahead. He didn't have much, but what he had, he passed on." Caroline's chest tightened again, though she didn't show it. She'd inherited her own lessons from a father who believed affection was weakness and success was the only measure of worth. Maybe that's why she'd never been able to tell the difference between love and leverage. She straightened, folding her arms. "You're not what you seem, Daniel Brooks." "Neither are you," he said, returning to his work. And for the first time in a long while, Caroline Vega realized she wasn't sure if she'd just been complimented or warned. It started with a sandwich. Caroline was leaving late, the office nearly empty, when she saw Daniel and a small girl sitting cross-legged on the floor outside the service elevator. Sophie's hair was a wild halo around her face, a peanut butter sandwich in one hand, a juice box in the other. Daniel was flipping through her sketchbook while she chattered about the superhero squirrel she'd drawn. "You're working overtime?" Caroline asked, stopping a few steps away. Daniel looked up, not embarrassed exactly, but cautious. "Couldn't get a sitter tonight. Sophie's good with hanging out while I finish up." Sophie grinned at her, peanut butter on her cheek. "Hi." "Hi," Caroline said, her voice softer than she intended. She'd spent most of her life avoiding mess, emotional and otherwise, but there was something about the little girl's unfiltered warmth that tugged at her. "You hungry?" Caroline asked, glancing between them. Sophie shrugged. "I already got a sandwich." "I meant your dad." Daniel tilted his head, studying her. "I could eat." That's how they ended up in the small break room, sitting at the round table usually, reserved for interns trying to avoid their bosses. Caroline heated up leftover pasta from the executive lounge, setting plates in front of them. Sophie dug in without hesitation. Daniel murmured a quiet, "Thanks." They talked in easy fits and starts, about Sophie's school project on animals, about Daniel's stubborn truck that wouldn't pass inspection, about the time Caroline got stuck in an elevator for 45 minutes and ended up drafting an entire merger plan on a takeout menu. At one point, Sophie leaned against her dad's arm, half asleep, and Caroline noticed the way Daniel instinctively curved around her, like even gravity couldn't pull her away from his protection. When Sophie's breathing evened out, Daniel shifted her gently into his lap. "Sorry if "We're taking up your night," he said quietly. "You're not," Caroline said. And for the first time, she meant it. A silence settled, not awkward, but present. Caroline found herself watching his hands as he smoothed back Sophie's hair, the calluses along his fingers catching the light. They were hands built for fixing things, yet they held his daughter like she was glass. "You ever think about playing again?" she asked. "Chess?" She nodded. "Only when I'm teaching Sophie," he said, smiling faintly. "She's already better than half the guys I used to play with." Caroline caught the way his eyes softened when he looked at his daughter, and something shifted in her chest again, something she didn't have a name for yet. When they finally stood to leave, their hands brushed as she passed him the pasta container. It was barely a touch, but she felt it all the way up her arm. Daniel looked at her for a beat too long. Then he said, "Good night, Ms. Vega," and walked away with Sophie in his arms. She watched them go, realizing she wasn't sure who she wanted to see again. More, the man who beat her in 3 moves, or the little girl who had already won her without even trying. The first blow came during the quarterly shareholders' luncheon. Caroline hadn't invited Daniel. Of course she hadn't. It was an event of tailored suits and polished speeches, not grease-stained sneakers and quick, crooked smiles. But the universe had its own ideas. Halfway through her keynote presentation, she noticed movement near the back of the ballroom. Daniel was there, standing just inside the doorway in his work shirt, holding a clipboard. Beside him was Sophie, in a faded denim jacket, looking small and out of place among the towering arrangements of white orchids. He caught her gaze across the crowd. She could read the silent message in his expression, "The freight elevator's down again, and she had to come with me." Before she could slip over to him, one of the shareholders, a man who'd been eyeing her job for years, leaned toward the table microphone. "Caroline, I see we have visitors from the maintenance department today." The room rippled with polite laughter. All eyes turned. Daniel froze, his jaw tightening, and Sophie's fingers curled into his sleeve. Caroline's instinct was to control the narrative, to deflect. But the tension in the air was thick, and her silence stretched too long. "Must be nice," the shareholder added, his voice dripping with false charm, "knowing your staff feels so comfortable stopping by." It was meant to be a joke. It landed like a knife. Daniel shifted Sophie to his other side, his voice carrying just enough for the nearest tables to hear. "Didn't mean to interrupt your little club, sir. Just trying to make sure the building you're standing in doesn't trap you between floors." The laughter stopped. Caroline's heart thudded. She wanted to step in, to defend him, but her eyes caught the cluster of investors at the front table, the subtle tilt of their heads. In their world, siding with him would mean choosing sentiment over strategy. So she didn't speak. Daniel noticed. She saw the flash of it across his face, a quick, sharp cut of disappointment, before he turned and left with Sophie. By the time she wrapped up the presentation and slipped out to find them, they were gone. That night, she couldn't stop replaying it. His expression when the laughter had rolled over him. The way she'd frozen, measuring her response not by truth, but by the audience watching her. In her penthouse kitchen, she stared at her reflection in the dark glass of the window. She'd spent years building a fortress of reputation and control, brick by careful brick. But for the first time, she wondered if that fortress had just turned into a wall between her and something she didn't even realize she wanted. Somewhere across the city, Daniel was tucking Sophie into bed, his hands still smelling faintly of oil and the orchids she'd brushed against on their way out. And if he thought of her at all, it wasn't with the warmth she'd grown used to. It was with the cold edge of someone who'd been reminded exactly where he didn't belong. Caroline found him 2 days later, in the dim light of the sub-basement where the old freight elevator sat open like a gutted beast. The air was thick with the metallic tang of grease and the low hum of a portable work light. Daniel didn't look up when she stepped in. "You lost." "No." She kept her voice even, though her pulse was racing. "I came to talk." His wrench clicked against metal. "Talk. Or explain why you let a room full of people laugh at me." Her stomach tightened. "I didn't let them. You didn't stop them." He straightened, finally meeting her gaze. His eyes were darker than she remembered, the warmth stripped away. "I wasn't expecting applause, Caroline. But I didn't expect you to stand there like you didn't even know me." She bristled, even as guilt pricked under her skin. "Do you have any idea what it's like in that room? One wrong word, and they'd eat me alive." "I was protecting." "Yourself," he cut in. You were protecting yourself. Her jaw tightened. And what would you have had me do? His voice dropped, slow and controlled, which somehow made it hit harder. I brought Sophie because I didn't have a choice. That elevator's on my watch. I was doing my job. She wanted to tell him she understood. But the truth was, she didn't, not really. She'd never had to juggle keeping the lights on with making sure someone small and fragile felt safe. You think I'm embarrassed of you, she said instead. I know you are, he replied, wrench in hand, his voice like stone. You can handle losing at chess in front of your boardroom. But God forbid they see you talking to the guy who keeps their building standing. Her throat went tight. The worst part was, he wasn't entirely wrong. He stepped past her toward the door, his tool belt clinking. Don't worry. You won't have to pretend anymore. Daniel. But he was already halfway down the hall, the echo of his boots swallowing her voice. She stood in the humming silence, hands clenched at her sides, feeling the strange, hollow ache of something breaking. Not the kind of break she could fix with an apology in the next meeting. This was deeper, slower, the kind that settled in the cracks of your ribs and stayed there. By the time she walked back into the elevator and pressed the button for the 34th floor, her reflection in the mirrored wall looked composed, untouched. But her chest felt like it had been pried open. Across the city, Daniel carried Sophie's backpack into their apartment. He didn't tell her about the conversation. He just made dinner, helped with homework, and told himself he was fine. But when Sophie asked, "Are we still going to see Ms. Vega?" he answered without looking up. "No, baby. We're not." The call came just after midnight. Caroline was still at her desk, a single lamp casting a pool of light over scattered contracts, when her phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. "Ms. Vega," a voice asked. "This is St. Luke's Hospital. You're listed as an emergency. Contact for Sophie Brooks." Her pulse spiked. "What happened?" "She's stable," the nurse said quickly, "but she had a severe asthma attack. Her father's here, but he asked us to call you." Caroline didn't remember grabbing her coat or how she got there. The next thing she knew, she was pushing through the automatic doors, the antiseptic smell hitting her like a wall. Daniel was in the pediatric wing's waiting area, elbows on his knees, hands clasped tight. He looked up when she approached, and for the first time since she'd met him, there was no guarded wall in his eyes, only raw, unfiltered fear. "She couldn't breathe," he said, voice rough. One second she was laughing at some cartoon, the next she was gasping. I didn't think we'd make it here in time." Caroline sat beside him without thinking. "Is she?" "They've got her on oxygen. They say she's okay now." His shoulders slumped, but his grip on his hand stayed white-knuckled. "I don't know what I'd do if—" He cut himself off, jaw locking. She touched his forearm, a small, steady pressure. "You don't have to finish that sentence." They sat in silence for a moment, the hum of fluorescent lights overhead, the distant beep of monitors down the hall. She could feel the tremor in his arm under her hand. "I didn't want to call you," he admitted. "But she asked for you." In the middle of it, she kept saying your name. The words punched through her like nothing else could have. She swallowed hard. "Then I'm glad you did." When the nurse finally came to tell them Sophie was awake, Daniel stood, but hesitated, glancing at her. "You can come in too." Inside the small hospital room, Sophie sat propped against a pile of pillows, a tiny plastic mask over her nose and mouth. Her eyes lit up when she saw them both. "You came." Caroline smiled, tucking a stray curl behind Sophie's ear. "Of course I did." They stayed by her bed for hours, Daniel on one side, Caroline on the other, listening to her talk between slow breaths about a dream she'd had, about how much she hated hospital pudding. At some point, Daniel's hand brushed Caroline's on the blanket. Neither of them moved it away. When Sophie drifted back to sleep, Daniel looked across the bed at her. His voice was quiet, almost a whisper. "I don't know how to do this alone forever." Caroline met his gaze, her throat tight. "Maybe you don't have to." It was the first thing either of them had said all night that didn't feel like a defense. A week after Sophie left the hospital, Caroline found herself standing outside Daniel's apartment building, a modest brick place with peeling paint and a squeaky front door. She'd called ahead, but he hadn't answered. She almost turned around, until the door opened and Sophie appeared, her curls bouncing as she ran toward her. "You came." Caroline knelt to hug her. "I brought something." She held up a small wooden box. Inside, the chessboard gleamed, same rich mahogany as the one from the 34th floor, but smaller, travel-sized. For you and your dad, she told Sophie. Thought maybe you could teach me this time. Daniel stepped into the doorway, watching them. His expression was unreadable, but he didn't tell her to leave. Come in, he said quietly. The apartment smelled faintly of fresh coffee and laundry soap. A small stack of Sophie's drawings lined the fridge, and a battered couch sat near the window where sunlight poured in. It was nothing like her penthouse, and yet it felt warmer. They sat at the kitchen table, Sophie between them. Daniel set up the board. White or black? Caroline smiled faintly. Neither. Let's play on the same side. He raised an eyebrow, but didn't argue. They turned the board so they faced the same direction, moving pieces together, whispering strategies to Sophie. Sometimes he'd point out a move she'd missed. Sometimes she'd notice something he hadn't. There was no rush, no scoreboard, just the quiet rhythm of planning and laughing over Sophie's dramatic check calls. Halfway through, Sophie excused herself to grab more juice, leaving them alone at the table. I was wrong, Caroline said softly. At the luncheon. In the basement. All of it. Daniel's gaze stayed on the board. You were protecting your world. I get it. That's the problem, she said. I've been protecting my world so long. I forgot it could be bigger. Better. You and Sophie, you're what I didn't know I was missing. When he finally looked at her, there was no anger left, just a quiet searching, like he was making sure she meant it. I can't be someone I'm not, Caroline. I wouldn't want you to be. For a long moment, the only sound was the soft scrape of a pawn sliding forward. Then his hand found hers on the table, warm and certain. Sophie returned, climbing back into her chair. Okay, whose turn? Ours, Daniel said. Together, they moved their queen into position, flanking the black king. Sophie grinned. Checkmate. Caroline laughed, the sound lighter than it had been in years. And as Daniel's fingers stayed laced with hers on the table, she realized this wasn't about winning anymore. It was about building something, piece by piece, side by side, until the board felt like home. If you believe in love that breaks barriers, redemption through vulnerability, and building a future together, then hit that like button, share this story, and subscribe to the channel for more heart-stirring romances. Thanks for watching.